There is a place where fears and fantasies get weighed on substance alone. Legends and lures are examined in a fresh light. Conspiracy theory meets conspiracy fact. We've embraced the possibilities. Now beyond the threshold, you are in the new realms.
Just out of nowhere, we've seen this huge white light coming in over the horizon. I started getting this demonic thoughts, strange object in the sky. And I tried to scream, and I tried to wake up, and I couldn't.
Cosmology, paranormal, and abduction.
The shadow people or the end or some other things by falling demonic in nature. Demonic in nature.
I want to know.
Brayllian Report. Welcome back to Thresholds Radio. With us right now is David Weatherly. David's been a paranormal researcher, I believe, for 35 years or more. I could be wrong, but he just wrote a book, The Black-Eyed Children, or BEKs, if we've discussed on here before, that terrifying subject. How you doing there, David?
I'm great, John. How are you?
I'm pretty good. You want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself? Did I get that right? Have you been doing this 35 years, or how close am I?
You got it. I've been actively investigating in the field for over 35 years now. I started when I was a teenager, had an interest in the paranormal from the time I could read. And when I started in the field, I approached the paranormal in a very holistic manner. So that term to me, it meant not just haunted sites, but also cryptids and UFOs and really the whole spectrum. So, for all those years, I've investigated and pursued research in a pretty broad spectrum across the paranormal.
Well, yeah, I know we were talking about that off air, too. We both agree on that. Paranormal covers anything, basically, that's not normal. It's not just ghosts, like a lot of people will say. It's basically anything, UFOs, Bigfoot, anything whatsoever that just is not in the normal realm.
Exactly. What's beyond the normal? And, the term has kind of been co-opted in the last several years by some of the paranormal television shows that focus only on haunted sites, but it really does cover the whole spectrum.
But your key thing that got me interested here is your Black-Eyed Children book. We've talked about them before, and it's a fascinating subject. What got you started in this? What got you interested? Or is it like me, it was just such an amazing thing, you just had to start digging into it as soon as you heard about it?
Well, I heard about the Black-Eyed Children initially in the late 90s because with the growth of the Internet, a couple of stories showed up that were posted online in some of the early discussion forums that told stories about these Black-Eyed Children. And being interested in paranormal in general, I would just, absorb all this information that was being posted on the net, read the stories, thought they were really interesting. However, at the time, it was kind of right there on the edge. I thought, well, this is weird and creepy and interesting, but could be urban legend, could be a hoax. Just sort of filed it away and took a wait-and-see attitude. Well, what happened was, a few years later, I met a gentleman named Paul, whose story is covered in depth in the book. And Paul, he's one of these guys that didn't believe in anything to do with the paranormal. But at the same time, he couldn't leave it alone. And if you've been in the field very long, you start to recognize these types of personalities. They can't leave it alone because there's something that haunts them. And, Paul would always make these cracks, asking if I'd caught Bigfoot or, spotted any flying saucers and things like this. And I would just laugh it off.
Right.
And, at one point, he ran into me having lunch and asked to join me one day. And we started talking. And suddenly this guy just opened up. Now, Paul he's 6'3", 6'4", big guy, bodybuilder, martial artist. He was a prison guard. This is a guy who has seen, prison brawls and people shanked in front of him and just the worst that society can offer. He's never been afraid of anything in his life. All of a sudden, this man is telling me a story, and he's shaking when he starts telling the story about an encounter with a pair of kids that showed up at his door and absolutely terrified him. And he was hoping to get answers. Unfortunately at the time, I didn't have a whole lot of answers for him other than to say, this is not an isolated incident. There are other people that have reported this. And, I talked to them in depth about things that were similar in nature to the black-eyed children, but, it sort of set me on course to dig around and start finding more witnesses and more information. And the more I dug into it, the more fascinating it became.
It's a creepy story, actually, too, because from, like say we were talking off air, I know about this, too. It's kind of the fear factor. I mean, it's not just, these kids come up and do it. People are terrified. Every encounter or every story I heard, they're just, like, totally freaked.
That's correct. And, this aspect is very difficult for people to understand when they initially hear the stories a lot of the times, because the initial thought is, okay, so it's a 10-year-old kid and he's got solid black eyes. It's creepy, but so what? No, there's much more going on in these encounters. And, in general, what we find happens with the victims is that they are first uneasy. That unease rapidly goes to being outright nervous, and that rapidly escalates into just complete fear and terror. All they can do is run away from these children. So, we're not sure what's going on. I mean, there could be something akin to infrasound taking place. There may be some kind of energy these children are emitting that causes this fear reaction or interacts with the human nervous system. But there's definitely something transpiring on another level that is causing this level of fear to be generated within the victims. And, of course, it is creepy, too, because from a physical standpoint, these children, the most often described range is between 8 and 13 years of age. Their skin is usually described as being pale or, just looking pasty or, unnatural. And, of course, the eyes are solid black. And that element is usually not noticed until partway into the encounter. In other words, the children will out there and approach or knock on the door, and they'll have their heads down. And when the person answers, they'll start talking in a very monotone fashion to the person who's answered the door. They're making very odd requests. At some point, they will look up and make eye contact, and at that moment, the person realizes, my God, these kids have solid black eyes. And to be clear, we're not talking about just the pupil. We're talking about the entire sclera. The entire eye is solid black.
Right. And for people that haven't listened, a lot of people know this, but I mean, key thing they want, whether it be your car or your house, is to want in, which kind of reminds me of like the old vampires. But every case I've heard, they want to be let in. And that's basically all they ever say, too, is let us in. And they repeat the same thing. You're finding the same thing, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, we hear a lot of different phrases, but ultimately their goal is to be invited inside, whether that's, inside a home, inside a car, inside a place of business. And sometimes they'll come up with, very strange things because their language, one, it's very monotone is how a lot of people describe it. Two, they do repeat the same phrases over and over again. It's almost as if they've been programmed or they've memorized a certain number of phrases, and they just default back to those. But some of the language doesn't even really come off as natural. For instance, there was a case of a woman who had closed up a convenience store late at night, and she was in the back trying to count the money. And this is one of those places with the 24-hour gas pumps outside, but the store itself had closed. And someone came and was knocking on glass doors, and she said, this happens on a fairly regular basis. Usually either a drunk or somebody that thinks they can get in to buy a soda or something like that. So, 99% of the time she ignores it, the person goes away, and it's all done. But this knocking, it just kept going and going and going. And finally she goes out to see, what's happening and run these people off, and it's kids. And, she approaches the door, she doesn't want to open it, but these kids are sort of talking, at her through the glass. And they're saying things, let us in, we want to shop. Well, that's just not even a natural phrase for somebody to utilize.
Right.
We want to shop. And this is the kind of thing that we find in these encounters, these very bizarre phrases. Just let us in, this won't take long. And I think that's hands down one of the creepiest ones I've heard.
Yeah.
So,
what won't take long? That's kind of
yeah,
creepy.
Exactly. What won't take long? So it's that too is a very disturbing element in these encounters. And what some people will report is that they believe there is attempted mind control being exerted by these children. Interviewed a woman who had an encounter with a pair of these kids, and her story was very interesting in that she had used hypnotherapy herself to quit smoking. And when she started going to the hypnotist, she had a difficult time going into trance. So she actually had to work with him a little bit to get to that state where she was allowing herself to be hypnotized. And she said because of that process, she distinctly remembered what the feeling was like when she started to go into trance, and even when it just initially started from his phrases. So when she encountered these kids, they started repeating these phrases in this very monotone fashion. She said all of a sudden she realized she was having that same sensation as she had at the onset of a hypnosis session.
Oh, wow.
And, of course it made her run away from these kids, but I found that very fascinating because people have, noted that they feel like these kids are lulling them into, just a state of complying. And, it's repeated in a lot of these encounters where the victim will stand there, they'll listen to what these kids are saying, and they won't even realize that, they've been opening their own door as if they are going to invite the kids in. And something kind of snaps and they realize, oh my God, what am I doing?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, like I say, all those things I've studied too. I was telling you off air, I actually had a friend, a Chicago paramedic, that had that happen too, and they came right up to his window and he just looked and jumped and they're like, let us in. We need to come in. And they just kept repeating it and then turned his head and bam, an accident happened right outside and people died. And he was freaked about that whole thing. When we had him on the air, people were just like fascinated by that.
Yeah, that's a very disturbing story, and it's, there are some accounts that imply that these children are some type of omen, because we find a fair number of people who have encountered them and then later had, a whole series of unfortunate things happen in their lives, or even tragedies. There have been people that have encountered these kids and all of a sudden, right after it, they'll get a phone call that, a relative has died, or things like that. So they do seem to be on some level harbingers of misfortune.
What's your view? I'm actually not quite sure on this. I've been studying this too, David. We were talking about it. What do you think they are, or their reasoning? I know that's a crazy question, but what's your kind of view on this? What do you think they are?
I get asked that all the time.
Yeah, I know. It's a question. I say it's a question you really can't answer, but.
Right. No, actually, I feel like I can answer what my opinion is, at this point.
Right.
I will say that I wrote the book without an agenda, and what I did was, you'll see in the book there's a comparison and, chapters that go into all the various possibilities to explain these children, because one of the weird things about this phenomenon, and one of the things that fascinates me the most, quite honestly, is that it does cross the boundaries into a lot of different types of phenomena. You could argue that these kids are alien hybrids. You could argue that they're some kind of demonic entity.
Exactly.
It's funny because when the book first came out, one of the first people that contacted me that read it said, I loved your book. You convinced me they're alien hybrids. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I wasn't trying to convince anybody. That,
right.
and literally the next day I had a person contact me and say, I loved your book. You've convinced me. They're demons. and it just, it brought a smile on my face. I was like, okay, that's exactly what I want. I want people to decide for themselves. But, as far as what I believe at this point, it's going to sound a little bit out there, but my opinion now is that these creatures, because they're not really children, these creatures are some type of interdimensional being that is coming through into our reality. Whatever their purpose is, I believe it's very sinister.
Exactly. That's actually what I've said too. That's kind of my feeling. I'm not sure, but I'm leaning towards that too.
Yeah, I mean, there are interesting arguments to say, wow, they could be, alien hybrids, or they could be this or that. But really, that's where I am at this point with it. And, there's a lot of evidence. One of the things that fascinates me and has sort of led me to this conclusion is that after looking at hundreds and hundreds of these encounters, I find it very interesting that the culmination of the encounter seems to be causing the victim to reach that high level of fear. Because the bulk of the time, when the victim reaches that peak of fear, these kids disappear. It's as if that's what they were trying to achieve.
They're just feeding off of the energy or the fear or something.
Exactly. And I talk about this a little bit in the book. There's a section on, tulpas and thought forms, and those are beings that are initially created from pure mental energy and take on physical form. And ultimately, they can exist on their own, but they still need to have energy for sustenance, and what they feed on is emotional energy. Well, fear is one of the most intense emotional energies. So I find it fascinating, as I said, that these encounters, the victim reaches a peak of fear, and all of a sudden these kids vanish.
That's weird. So the interdimensional thing is kind of what I was thinking too, for one reason. You've had a lot more research on this, but from what I've seen, the few people I've talked to, and from what I said, nobody ever sees these kids like walk up to your door or walk to your car. They just seem to be there all of a sudden. That's what makes me think they just kind of appear. What have you heard from people like that? Do people see them walking up, or are they just appearing?
There are some cases where people have seen them walking, but that's an interesting point, because very often what happens is, these kids. There's numerous cases where people believe the kids glide or move at an incredible rate of speed, because the person will turn around just for a second and turn back, and all of a sudden these kids are much closer, for instance.
Yeah.
And there's no sound from their footsteps, or there's no obvious body movement or shuffling around or anything. It's almost as if they're just kind of blip, and they're in a different location. As far as their disappearance, now that's one of the things that's really weird about these cases. They do vanish. The encounter that Paul had, Paul ended up, he had the extreme fear reaction. He had slammed his door on these kids, had this extreme reaction of fear, walked across the room to get away from the front door, and then he heard this rapping sound again, and when he turned around, he saw the face of one of these kids peering in the little glass pane on the side of his door, and just staring in the room at him and tapping on the glass. And that caused something to click in Paul, I think, because he was sort of out of range, if that makes any sense, of their vibration,
their psychic powers or whatever they use. He was out of their maybe they got a 10-foot 10-foot range or something.
Yeah, there's no telling. I mean, this could be something, again, we look at something like infrasound, which has a distinct range,
right,
or sounds that, we just don't perceive normally with the human ear that do affect the nervous system. So, Paul evidently was far enough away that it caused something to click in him. He went from incredible fear to just outrage. I mean, he was really angry, and he saw this face peering in his house, ran into his bedroom, grabbed a firearm, ran back out, and we're talking, this guy's trained, this is only a few seconds, the bedroom's right there, he flings that front door open, and these kids have vanished. They're nowhere in sight. He looks in the yard, the driveway, the street, everywhere. They're nowhere in sight. And we hear this time and time again where the person, will just turn around, and they'll turn back, and these kids have vanished.
That was the exact same case for my friend. He was a Chicago paramedic, and Chicago's a busy city, and it was a wide open street, and there was nowhere to go, and they just vanished.
Yeah, it's there's one that's in the book that I found really fascinating, because the witness was a deputy sheriff, and his story was he got called on a domestic disturbance. This was, I'm thinking it was like 3:30 in the morning. He goes to the home. He deals with the people. He doesn't arrest anybody. He's out sitting in his patrol car filling out his paperwork or something, and he looks up at the house next door to the one he was called to, and he sees on the deck of this house these two kids standing there. And, of course, his first thought as a police officer, my God, it's 3:30 in the morning. Why are these two little kids outside? So he gets out of his car, he goes up. This is a raised deck with one set of steps. He goes up the steps. He sees these two kids standing there, and he starts to engage them. He says, are you kids okay? What are you doing out here? Did the noise wake you up? What's happening? And these kids, he's looking them over as he's talking to them, and he's realizing their clothes look kind of shabby. They're very pale. He's looking in their faces, and he's realizing their eyes are black, and he's thinking, my God, maybe this is some kind of abuse, situation going on, or, he's running through all the possibilities.
Right.
The only thing the kids will say is they won't let us inside. So, intending to get to the bottom of it, he opens the screen door and he's pounding on the front door of this home, calling out, sheriff's department, open up. Now, he's blocking the steps with his position and with the door that he's holding open. He pounds on that door, he turns around, these kids are gone.
Huh.
This is a wide open yard with no trees. He sort of does a double take, he gets his flashlight out, he's shining it all over the yard, in the street. There's no sign of these kids anywhere. There's no way they got past him.
Right.
Had they gotten off, they would have had to climb the railing and jump down to the ground. So, all in a couple of seconds. And it's just a very bizarre case. And this, again, this is from a sheriff's deputy, someone who's trained to observe things. He did incidentally end up getting someone to come to the door. It was an elderly woman, no children of her own, no grandchildren, didn't know what this guy was talking about. And, he's been puzzled by it since then. I mean, he searched the neighborhood, and, it's something that has just stuck with him. He can't figure out what it was he encountered.
And that's a credible witness, too. That's the type of person you can really take their word for it.
Exactly.
What is one of your better witness accounts, or is that your better one?
That's a really good one. There's a few in the book that really stand out to me. There's one that's I'll tell you about. It actually came to me after the book was published, so it was put on my blog. But I found some elements of it very creepy. It was a gentleman in the Dallas, Texas metro area. He came home from the store, and walked up to his front door, put his hand on the door, and opened it, and suddenly realized there's this kid, this single kid, standing on the ground by his steps. And he turns and looks at this kid and realizes this boy's got solid black eyes. He's just sort of staring up at the man. And what he says to the gentleman is it food time?
Is it food time?
Is it food time? And this guy is just, he told me he just, he felt the blood rushing down, the hair go up on the back of his neck,
Right.
and this kid is staring at him, and this kid says again, I think it's food time. You should invite me in. Mm. And here's another interesting aspect of this encounter. This gentleman has a 3-year-old pit bull. He raised this dog from a puppy, and he has seen this dog face down rattlesnakes and kill them. This dog is in the back of the house somewhere. The house has solid wood floors. He hears the dog barking. The door has swung all the way open. There's a hallway that goes from the front door down to the living room. He looks down the hallway and sees his pit bull turn the corner, at a full run, charging down that hallway towards the front door. He got about halfway to the front door, and this dog tried to put the brakes on a wood floor. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of your listeners have seen this type of thing before. This dog literally fell over himself because he slid on that floor. He tumbled out onto the step, jumped up, turned around with his tail between his legs and his head down, whining, running back into the house as quick as he could. The dog hid under the bed in the master bedroom for days.
Wow.
this dog was completely terrified when it got within some kind of range of this kid.
No, I've actually heard a shadow people story similar to that, where the animals have freaked and took off. Same kind of thing, where people have discussed a shadow person. Maybe that's another form of a BEK or something too.
That's really interesting. There's only a couple of cases that I've heard where there was an animal present, and it's really fascinating to hear this kind of reaction. Animals have much greater degree of sensitivity to some things than humans do. So, to see and hear about that kind of reaction from an animal is pretty intriguing. And so, the fellow, obviously he went in the house and slammed the door as quick as he could, and, he put his groceries down and went into another room and looked out the window to see what this kid was doing, and the kid had vanished at that point.
Huh. Have you actually any correlation between shadow people, David, or MIBs, Men in Black? It kind of sounds like the same thing, somewhat. Anything you've discovered where they're kind of intermixing or anything?
I looked at the correlations between the black-eyed children and shadow people, and when I was writing the book, I just didn't see enough correlations to talk about that really in the book. So there's not a correlation between them and shadow people in the book. There is, however, a chapter on the similarities with the Men in Black, because there are quite a few connections between the two. For instance, this monotone speech that a lot of the accounts talk about is the same thing we find often in Men in Black encounters. The pale or pasty skin is something we often find. The odd use of language.
And the odd behavior, too.
Or memorized.
I was going to say that odd behavior they have, too. They both have that, too.
Yes, yeah, and very stiff. People don't report these kids moving around a whole lot, which is kind of odd. They're often standing in what would be an odd manner for, kids. Kids are usually kids that age are usually a bit more relaxed, but these children are often very stiff. They often have their arms hanging at their sides and things like that. And something that's really intriguing, even since the book has come out, there are more connections between the black-eyed children and the Men in Black, because this whole thing has surfaced that deals with electronic interference in conjunction with black-eyed child encounters.
Right, like when we tried to start our interview today.
Which, may or may not be coincidence, but I'll tell you, you have to stop calling things coincidence when they happen over and over and over again.
Right.
But there have been other weird things, too. I've told this story a few times, but after the book came out, I received an email. It was a few months after it was out. I got an email from this woman who said, I don't want you to think I'm crazy. And that's always it's always kind of a loaded open, and you don't know what you're going to get. But this woman was pretty interesting. She told me that she started reading the book the first night. Her smoke alarm went off. So, she wasn't any smoke in the house. She got up, shut the alarm off. The second time she sat down to start reading it, the timer on her oven went off. And she said she didn't even know what it was at first because she never uses it. And then the third night she sat down to start reading the book, her garage door opened itself, and that was kind of the final straw for her. And she said, look, I'm really interested in this phenomenon, but I don't want any visits, I don't want any encounters with these things.
Wow.
And I just want to know if anybody else has experienced this. And, the truth is, ultimately, I've been in a lot of contact with her, and in recent weeks it's become evident that she actually has some suppressed memories that she's starting to bring through about an encounter with some of these black-eyed children.
Wow.
But there have been other situations where there has just been this weird, electronic interference that comes in, and it's unexplainable. I was on Dreamland with Whitley Strieber, and when we started the interview, we actually had to start and stop a couple of times because he was having these weird things happen in his studio, and he told me, he says, I've been doing this show for years, David, and I've never seen this kind of thing happening. And
well, that's interesting.
Weird,
like what we had when we were talking for 20 minutes before. I go, okay, we're going to record now, and all of a sudden you can't hear me.
Right. Right. And all of a sudden we're getting this weird echo when we start to record. So,
Wow, that's creepy.
yeah, it's very creepy, and there have been other similar situations that have happened. It's this weird electronic stuff will come in, and again, that harkens back to some of the classic Men in Black encounters, where the person who encounters these beings will later have strange sounds on their telephone, odd reactions from electronic devices, and so forth.
Well, how about the kids? The ages are what, like 11, 12, 13? Isn't that what people usually say, somewhere around there? I mean, are there variations? Are you getting older ones? I mean, are you getting like BEKs in their 20s, or is it always like the children?
There are accounts of black-eyed adults. Now, I didn't include those in the book for a number of reasons. One is that those are far fewer. Two, we really get into a range where we're looking at more hoaxing going on, and there's a small number of those that seem very credible and interesting, and I'll probably cover that at some point in another book or something else. But the book itself deals with just the kids. The range that I find most of the reports fall into is between 8 and 13 years of age. And, bear in mind that a lot of the times you're having adults who don't have any kids of their own just kind of estimating. So it's very common for me to hear 10 years old. That seems to be the most common age for some reason. People think, oh, this kid must have been 10 years old. Right in that up to those preteen years is where we find the most reports.
And one thing I found when I was doing this research, the common thing, and I know you've heard this too, contacts, but those are like $350 and kids aren't going to be doing that. But they do have solid black contacts, but they are not cheap.
They're not cheap, and that was one of the first things I actually really looked at when I started looking at this phenomena. I looked at two things. One is the possibility or potential for hoaxing, and two, were there any medical conditions that could account for this appearance? Because you commonly see the skeptics will jump up and down and say, "Oh no, it's black contacts," or "Oh no, it's drug use," and so my approach was the medical aspect. I talked to some medical professionals, and I said, is this possible? Does it happen? There's not really a condition that I've ever found or heard from any physicians that would account for a solid black eye. The person would essentially be blind if that was the case. There are a couple of conditions that essentially create what's called a blown pupil, which causes the pupil to enlarge, but it doesn't change the color of the eye. The color, stays blue or brown or whatever it is naturally. So there's nothing really medically that accounts for this. As far as the potential for hoaxing, that's something I examined pretty thoroughly. First of all, yes, for a full sclera contact lens, you're looking in the range of $200 to $300, and that's kind of ridiculous for somebody to spend that amount of money to begin with. But you really have to stretch this out, because you're saying, okay, so a 10-year-old kid has swiped daddy's credit card to blow $300 on a pair of black contact lenses.
Right.
He's went to a neighborhood where no one knows him to knock on a random door and try to scare the hell out of somebody, and then he somehow runs away when they're not looking without any trace being left behind. I'm sorry, it's not happening. And you know what? To further sort of prove the point, I talked to a bunch of teenagers, and these kids, if you've got kids yourself or people listening have kids, you're going to know those kids are more interested in texting, listening to the latest hip-hop song, or whatever. They're not wasting their time and money for this, one-off prank that they really don't get any satisfaction out of. So, is there any hosting involved? Yeah, there's probably a couple here and there. But ultimately, that's not the reason behind these sightings. Well,
aren't they, I'm actually not sure. Aren't they normally in pairs or something? I mean, are there cases where they're just single kids too, or are they ever in more groups? I think all I've ever heard was like a couple of them or something.
Yeah, I've seen accounts where there's up to 3, and it seems to be most common that they come in pairs. There's a pair of them. But occasionally we do find just a single child shows up. Like the account in Texas, it was just a single child. that showed up at this gentleman's door. And then we get other weird things that come in too. There was an account from London, England, which was very fascinating. This was from a government employee, and this guy, he came home. He lived in a secure flat, so it was a keyed entry. He goes upstairs. He goes in his flat, and he's getting a beer or something, and he hears this thumping noise, is how he described it, out in the hallway. And he kind of listens to it for a second, and he's curious as to what it is, and goes about his business. Then he hears it again, and he opens the door, and here are these two kids standing right at his door, solid black eyes. He said the kids looked. He thought at first they were homeless. He thought they had, maybe hand-me-down clothing or something, and they were very pale. He's looking up and down the hallways, asking where their parents are, all the standard questions that any adult would ask. And as the encounter's taking place, these kids, now this gentleman, I should add, he's a native Brit, but he did a lot of his education in the United States. He's lived in a couple of other countries. He's well-traveled. And he told me that, these kids sounded like they were doing a poor imitation of a British accent. They're saying, we want to watch the telly. Let us in to watch the telly. And, like anybody else, he's wondering, what the heck is with these kids? He's getting nervous. He said that he looked inside his flat just thinking about, was there something he could grab to defend himself? When he turned, those few seconds, when he turns back around, the two kids are now 3.
Oh, wow.
There's a third one that has just manifested from somewhere, and they're all standing there staring at him. That's enough. He slams the door. He's very nervous. He's pacing around his flat, and he hears this thumping noise again. And this is kind of unusual. I've heard a couple of other accounts where there are these weird sounds prior to the account. This gentleman, was convinced that whatever that noise was, it was how they were arriving and then how they were leaving.
Oh, like their,
when he finally,
their gateway or whatever.
Exactly. He told me, he said it's like they dropped in from somewhere. And, he got up the nerve to go to the door and crack it open again and look in the hallway, and these kids are gone.
What's odd about that, actually, David, if you think about it, he's a growing man, and he has, 11, 12-year-old kid out there, and he's thinking of, what can I grab to defend myself? Think of that frame of mind. That shows you how afraid he was, because a normal adult wouldn't be looking for a weapon against a little kid. That's
absolutely correct, John. And the thing is, I like to mention to people that you have to understand there's a psychological component that occurs during these encounters. Anytime you mix children and the paranormal, it just changes the tone all the way across the board. And in a situation like this, we're hardwired as adults to help children. If a child shows up and needs something, your natural reaction is going to be, it's a kid that needs help.
Exactly.
What can I do? But, this other element that's taking place that we don't really understand, that's causing this nervousness and this fear, is really screwing with people's minds. So, these people, I can see it in their faces when they're recounting these encounters. There's this psychological battle that goes on. And a lot of these people will say to me, it looked like a kid. I felt like I should let them in and just help them. But at the same time, I felt like I was being eyed by a predator.
Wow.
And it really just sort of twists people's minds, and they can't, they get sort of locked up. They don't know what to do. Do I let this kid in? But what happens if I do? I'm terrified. Why am I terrified? It's just a kid. So it's a very hard thing for us to comprehend from the outside. You really have to think about that psychological component.
The obvious question here, has anybody ever let one in? That's still around to tell you about it.
Well, that's it's really kind of disturbing to ponder how many people have invited them in that we don't know about.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it just vanished. I was talking to someone earlier about this today. An incredible number of people go missing every year. And and I don't, and nobody get excited. I'm not saying the black-eyed kids are running around abducting people, but what if just 0.5% of that has something to do with these encounters? It's just really disturbing. But as far as encounters that have occurred that we know about, really, there's only a couple that are that have come to me that are valid accounts. Now, I have probably in the neighborhood of 5. Most of those I can't share because of the things that happened to the people. There is one that's detailed fully in the book, and the short version of it is that a woman was driving home. She had her 10-year-old son in the back seat of her SUV. He's sitting directly behind her. She stopped at a convenience store. She leaves the child in the SUV. She runs in to grab her milk or whatever. She comes back out, jumps in her car on autopilot. She's turning the key and she's looking in the mirror automatically, the rear view mirror. Staring back at her is a kid with solid black eyes.
Holy cow!
He's sitting in the middle of the seat, right beside her son. She immediately has this intense fear reaction. She jumped out of the SUV. She opened the back door and jerked her son out. She ran in the store. She was too nervous to drive her own car home. She ends up calling her husband. I'm sort of fast-forwarding a little bit to give you the gist of what unfolded here. A lot more details in the book, but she and her husband switched vehicles because the child has vanished, obviously. She has not told her husband what transpired at this point. She drives home. The husband in her SUV a couple of miles away has an accident and totals the vehicle.
Wow.
Ends up in the hospital under observation because they thought he had a concussion. He turned out to be fine. The 10-year-old son, she tries to engage him, and she's asking him, do you know that boy from school? No, Mommy, I don't know him. Well, why did he get in our car? Oh, I asked him to get in, Mommy. I thought we could go to my house and play. So this 10-year-old child, really just not knowing any better, seeing a potential playmate, he actually invited this boy into the SUV. And the aftermath of this encounter was that the 10-year-old child became very ill. They took him to the doctors. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him because his symptoms kept changing. They thought at one point he had the flu. They thought he had appendicitis. He broke out in a rash. They thought he had the measles. Every time they thought they knew what was wrong, his symptoms would change. And as a result, there was really nothing they could do for him. Ultimately, the family took the child home and turned to prayer and positive energy, being focused on this child for a while. And eventually he recovered and every symptom went away. He's perfectly healthy today.
Wow.
But the parents are completely convinced that, they encountered something that was outright evil.
That's creepy. Well, a lot of stuff I hear, like I said, you were saying the same thing. I kind of think there might be some sort of interdimensional thing, but I don't know. But a lot of what I hear and a lot of what people say is they think they're just positively convinced they're demons because of the terrible fear and the piercing black eyes.
Yeah, and that, a demon, we're really talking about, what people are commonly thinking in Catholic terms, the Catholic
right. description
of a demon, in terms of how the church views those entities. So, they well could be the same thing. It's just a label ultimately. But, these beings, whatever they are, coming from, if they are shifting in from some other dimension, it's just a very different way to think about probably the same thing.
Exactly. How about that? Like I say, we hit that before too. The alien-human hybrids. because they do have kind of a, ET look to them too. Are there a lot of people that might think that's it, or what are your people, that you talk to that have had these encounters? What are they coming up? What do they think it is, or do they know?
It's funny. The two most common things that people believe are that they're demons or that they are alien-human hybrids. And you could obviously make an argument for either one, quite honestly. As far as the hybrid similarities go, just looking at the image, I know you've seen the cover of my book.
I'm actually looking at it right now. It creeps the heck out of me.
Yeah, It creeps a lot of people. But it harkens back a little bit to the iconic cover of Communion by Whitley Strieber, and that very weird gray alien with the huge black eyes just sort of staring forward. And for years and years now, we've had a growing number of women who come forward and profess that they have been abducted and utilized for some type of breeding program by these gray aliens, and that the result are hybrid children who have solid black eyes, a very pale skin, usually very wispy hair, and some of the strange qualities of the gray sort of blended with human DNA. And there are people who firmly believe that that's what these things are. There are accounts in the book, in the section on hybrids, of people who believe they have encountered their children here on this planet that are the result of this hybrid program. And curiously enough, those are really the only accounts that seem to show up where the victim doesn't experience this level of fear. For instance, there's an account in the book of a woman who, she comes home and she hears a knocking at her back door, a pair of French doors that open onto the back of her home. And she goes to those doors. She looks out the window and she sees this boy standing there with solid black eyes and pale skin. And she said that when she saw him, she felt like she connected to him, and she instantly knew, and still believes to this day, that was her child.
Wow.
And that he was the result of she believes she's been abducted for a long period in her life, and that she was used for this breeding program. Now, she opened the door and saw him standing outside and saw a second child standing behind him, but she said that she did not feel connected to that second child. So right when she's opened this door and she's looking at this child, her husband comes in the front door and says something very loudly, hey honey, or something like that, and causes her head to snap around and look at him. And she quickly looks back to her patio, and these kids are gone. They've disappeared. And they live in they live in a gated community, with fences across the back. And, it's a very, one of those little planned suburban neighborhood communities.
Right.
And the husband, of course, runs outside because she's pointing out there. He thinks there's somebody messing around. He looks around. There's no sign of anyone. There's really no way these kids could have gotten out, or certainly not that quickly. So, she did not have the fear experience, and she firmly believes that this was her child, and that he just wanted to let her know that he was there. And she firmly believes that he's here somewhere, blending into society, essentially.
Have you ever had the opportunity, or any of these contact or people, whatever you want to call them, actually, have had these encounters, actually hypnosis or anything like that to, try to recall details? Has anybody ever tried anything like that?
A couple of them. Some of the people who I've interviewed in regards to abductions certainly have, because that's a common way for abductees to start regaining some of their memories. As far as people that have only encountered the black-eyed children, they're extremely reluctant to do that. You have to understand that these people are essentially trauma victims, and they have a lot of difficulty in their life after these encounters that all they want to do is move beyond it and forget it. The last thing they want to do usually is remember or re-experience these children. So a lot of them end up seeking different kinds of therapy or spiritual counseling, or they have a lot of symptoms, disrupted sleep patterns, continued nervousness. I mean, some of these people, they're very nervous if somebody comes to the door, still, because they're just that fear reaction almost starts to kick in. That oh my God, what if they're back?
So this is a long-lasting thing. It's not that you're at the door and you're scared, you close the door and you're over it. This is something that sticks with you.
It seems to, the bulk of these people who have these encounters, they're haunted by it. And, it's a very difficult thing for them to move beyond.
Have they had encounters, David, where, multiple times, where you've seen one and, like years later or a week later or something, you see him again?
No, not really. There's a couple of strange accounts. There's one from a woman who, she had an encounter with these kids at her apartment, and she said for a couple of days she kept seeing them in the like they'd be standing across the street from her when she was walking, and she would look at them, she would glance away for a second, and they would vanish, almost as if they hadn't quite gotten something from her they wanted. But there's not really any cases where we find multiple encounters. No.
That's interesting, because when you talk about alien abduction and that kind of stuff, they always say it reoccurs. So that's kind of
exactly. It's usually the opposite.
Right.
Now, a lot of these people, there are quite a few of these people who have nightmares about the children, and I've heard from more than one person that they will wake up from a dream and they'll set up in bed right in that in between state where they're not fully awake but not asleep either. They're waking up, they're sitting up in bed, and they hear this rapping sound, and they're convinced those kids have come back, and they're tapping on the window or the door or something, but they don't see them. They just feel that these kids have come back. That could be just a psychological manifestation of the trauma that these people have went through.
What's odd about this is actually, and like I say, I'm looking at the cover of your book, it just gives me a totally creepy, uneasy feeling. And anything like this. As a matter of fact, when I started this radio show years ago, the logo for the show was a BEK and scared people. I finally had to take it off because people complained it freaked them out. There's just something about this. It seems to scare people. Just looking at it just gives you the creeps.
Yeah, it sure does. It sure does.
Okay, do you have any thing coming up, David, or any shows you're going to be on, or how about your website or any information for everybody?
Yeah, sure. Actually, the middle of this month, the 18th through the 21st, I'll be at the Paradigm Symposium.
Oh, you're going to
Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm speaking at that.
Oh my! I want to go to that so bad, but it doesn't look like I'll be able to make it this year. I'm even running commercials for him for free.
Oh, this is going to be an incredible event, John. It really is. I'm deeply honored to be speaking. With the people that are on this panel. I mean, it's Eric von Daniken is coming to speak.
And he hasn't been,
in this country
15 years or something?
Yeah, it's somewhere between 10 and 15 years since he's been in this country at a speaking engagement like this. So, that alone, I mean, he's one of the first things I read as a kid. That's an honor.
Chariots of the Gods, yeah.
It's just an amazing A-list of people. Philip Copens, Bill Burns, Georgie Tsoukalos.
Yeah, Giorgio and his hair both. They have separate billings.
They'll both be there. Yeah, what hair, as he would say. So it's an amazing event. Again, that's a Paradigm Symposium. There are day passes available. It's an event not to be missed. I really think it's the event of the year, and you can find out about that at intrepidmag.com, and also I think it's paradigmsymposium.com.
It's actually kind of funny is right before we talk, we're pre-taping here. I run an ad for that. Right before I cut into you, we have an ad for that, actually.
Oh, that's funny.
Scotty's a friend of mine. I've had him on the air before, too, so I've been trying to help him out here.
Scotty's a good friend of mine, and as you probably noticed, he designed the cover of the book, so he did an incredible job with that. And of course, it's he and his business partner, Micah Hanks, who are producing this show. Otherwise, I've got a couple of other possibilities later this year. Nothing's firmed yet, so I won't say anything, but you can watch for my appearances on my blog. That is twocrowsparanormal.blogspot.com, and that is TWOCROWS paranormal.blogspot.com. There's also a badge on there for my Facebook. People are welcome to friend me on Facebook. I've got a Twitter feed, and that's really, those are the best sources right now to follow what I'm working on and where I'm appearing. You'll see stories on the blog from the whole range of the paranormal spectrum, from UFOs to cryptids to haunted sites. And as far as the book, the best place to purchase that is directly from leprechaunpress.com.
Right. You know, I had something I actually forgot to ask you, David. How many encounter stories have you heard, witness accounts? I mean, you know, in doing this book and everything, I mean, you're talking dozens, you know, hundreds. How many people have you encountered that have run into these things?
You know, I don't have an exact number, but I someone asked me that recently, and you know, I think it's over 1,000 at this point.
Oh my gosh! And what type of time range?
It's really the time range. Well, that's something interesting we didn't even really address, because you know, one of the things I set out to do when I started investigating this was to find encounters that predated the internet and television.
Right.
So there's a really fascinating encounter from 1950 in the book. But you know, even recently, I'm starting to hear stories from some Native American lore that relate to these things. So these creatures, whatever they are, have been around for a long time. It's just this modern term of BEK, or black-eyed children, black-eyed kids. That's what's recent, and that's what has come along with the advent of the internet.
So what really brought this all up was that story. What was it? The late '90s, 2000. That guy that, what was it? They wanted him to give him a ride to the movies or something like that.
Right. Brian Bethel in Texas. His story seems to be the one that sort of initiated the modern tales of the black-eyed children.
Because that's the one that got me interested. And actually, for a while, I thought it was just a urban legend or some sort of story. I wasn't sure, but then I started hearing more things about it. And probably the same with you. You probably, because when you first started researching this, it sounded so far out there you didn't know about it.
Exactly. But there are more and more stories. I mean, I'm not the only one tracking these things at this point. There's people all over the country and even abroad that are collecting these stories, and they're all getting different ones. I mean, every day practically I hear about new encounters, and they're all pretty fascinating.
You know, I do paranormal research. We were talking off air. I do the same thing as you do. And this stuff doesn't scare me. You know, I see a ghost, I'm not going to run away like the TV guys. I'm going to try to see if I can make contact with it or something. But the thought of running across the BEK scares the crap out of me. I do not want to see one of these things.
You know, I get asked that all the time, too, if I want to see one. And I'll tell you, I've had a lot of personal encounters with different types of phenomena. But I genuinely have no interest in a personal encounter with these things, simply because I've heard too many stories of them being an omen of ill fortune, of them just bringing, you know, very disastrous things to people's lives, and you know, it's just not something I'm interested in encountering. That's
what we'll do. We're going to go on your website and you see in your blog, I saw a BEK tonight, and then the blog's done. Okay, David. Well, it was great talking to you, and you have to get in touch if anything else comes up. You know, any amazing stories, or if somebody has an encounter, lets them in, and lives to tell a really good story. You have to let us know about it.
Definitely, John.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thanks for watching New Realms. We'll have a new show weekly until the brand new series comes out this fall. I'm Matt K. Thanks for